Today we're going to talk about how to progress your speed training. We're going to think about how to do this throughout the course of a year, but also kind of give you some ideas as to how to think about progressing longer term as well. I think oftentimes people get caught up in the trap of thinking that each year of training needs to sort of be the same kind of progression. I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but you aren't the same athlete today as you were a year ago or 3 years ago or 10 years ago. So it doesn't make sense to just simply take the progression you used at any given point in time and use that same progression every single year. You don't need to start over at the exact same point that you started in your first year of training if you're in your 10th year of training. So as we go through this and as we talk about progressing your training, don't think of this as something like you need to be locked into this exact progression and use this exact progression every year. What you focus on, how quickly you progress, where you start, where you finish, all that is going to depend on where you're at in your own training. So one athlete might start with a very regressed form of speed training because that's what's most appropriate for them, and they may not progress all the way through to the end of the progression in 1 year because maybe they don't need that yet, or maybe they're not really ready for that yet. Whereas another athlete may skip the first couple parts of the progression and focus more on, the more intense and specific forms of training because that's what they need where they're at in their own, long-term athletic development. So as we go through this, just kind of keep in mind that this isn't something where you need to look at this as being locked into a very specific progression, but I want to give you the tools and the concepts so that you can set up a progression, whether it's for yourself, an athlete you're coaching, maybe a team that you're coaching, whatever the case, so that you can see the different aspects of speed training as it relates to how to apply speed training to an athlete and how to change that training over time. So if we think about progressing over the course of the year, the first thing we want to do is develop acceleration. The only way you achieve high speeds in sprinting is by accelerating up to those speeds. So you can't run fast unless you're good at accelerating. Because acceleration is by definition performed below maximal velocity, acceleration is increasing your speed. So if you're increasing your speed, you haven't reached maximal velocity yet, so by definition, acceleration is performed below maximal velocity. It offers a safer way to introduce sprint training after a break or early in someone's career. So for someone who hasn't done any speed training, hasn't done any sprinting, acceleration is going to be speed training for them. If you've never sprinted in your life, then doing a 10-meter acceleration is going to be speed training. Whereas if you have a person who has been training in track and field, they're a sprinter, and they've been doing that for over a decade, you're not going to get any faster by just running 10s. So there's a time and a place to really emphasize acceleration as far as using it for speed training, and I think the situations where that applies is early in a year. So if you took a break from training, you haven't been sprinting, it's wise to reintroduce sprinting just as acceleration because the velocities aren't quite as high, the distances aren't as long, and so it's overall just a safer way to go. And that applies to whether you're new to sprinting or not. If you've taken a break or it's your first time sprinting, start with acceleration. You want to start with shorter accelerations and then progress to longer accelerations over time. So for example, a beginner or a younger athlete can stick with distances below 30 meters, whereas a more advanced or more experienced athlete may go up to 40 meters, 45 meters, somewhere in that range for their acceleration work. Anything beyond that is likely to be maximal velocity training for any given athlete. Some example workouts might be 2 to 3 sets of 10, 20, 30. Could be 2 to 3 sets of 20, 30, 40, 3 times 30 done 2 to 3 times, things like that. The more experienced you are as a sprinter, the more you should shift toward 30s and 40s. The more or the further into your training year, probably the more you want to be focusing on 30s and 40s rather than 10s and 20s. If you're new to sprinting, start with 10s. That's kind of the general idea. The further you sprint, the faster you're going to be going. So if you're not prepared to go fast, you don't want to do longer accelerations. If you are prepared to go fast, then you do want to shift to more longer accelerations because that's more specific, it's more intense, and it's a more potent stimulus. Early in a training year, you can do 2 acceleration sessions weekly. With one of them being resisted and one unresisted. You can also use contrasts. So for example, you might do some resisted accelerations and then some unresisted accelerations. It's up to you how you break that down, but you can incorporate some resisted sprinting. Just know that if all you do is resisted accelerations, probably not going to make you much faster after a certain point because you're simply not hitting very high velocities if you're doing resisted sprinting. Eventually you have to take the resistance off. You have to sprint without resistance, and that's really the only option you have if you want to run fast faster. But I think incorporating resisted sprints into your acceleration training can sort of build some of the underlying qualities that allow you to accelerate well. And if you can accelerate well, that's going to help you in your speed training later in the year. So I include that here as something to consider doing when you're developing acceleration. Now, once you have started to work on acceleration, you've exposed the athlete or yourself to some acceleration for a period of time to where you're no longer getting sore from that work and you feel pretty comfortable, like there's no risk of injury by going faster, that's when you want to progress to short speed work. With short speed work, I like to use flying sprints, but short flying sprints where the acceleration distance isn't very long and the flying sprint distance isn't very long. Real quick, if you don't know what a flying sprint is, essentially it's a sprint where you set up some cones and you have a zone where you're trying to hit your fastest speeds in that rep in that zone. Typically these are done from a dynamic start, so like a drop in or a skip in start rather than a 2-point, 3-point, 4-point or block start. By doing more of a dynamic start where you skip into it or sort of jog into the start before you initiate the sprint, it takes away some of the overcoming inertia that you have to do in a static start. So it's just a way to save energy, so you have more energy available to you for the actual, top speed part of the run. And also typically the acceleration will be maybe a little bit more smooth than it would be if you were doing a sprint from blocks. Once again, this is just to save some energy and make sure that you're set up to run your fastest in the zone that you're trying to do the flying sprint. So when you do a fly, you have an acceleration zone and a flying sprint zone. In the flying sprint zone, that's where you want to be running your fastest. Overall distances can be as low as 30 meters when you first introduce short speed work. You'll accelerate over a given distance like 20 to 25 meters if you're early in the year or early in your development as an athlete into a flying sprint zone that's as short as, say, 10 meters long. This allows you to begin developing speed qualities, but while still keeping the velocities sub-maximal in order to reduce injury risk. Now, for very young athletes, they may be hitting their top speed by 30 meters, so it may be a maximal speed workout for them if you're doing short speed work. But if you're not that fast and you're not hitting a very high velocity, then it's probably not as stressful as it would be for someone who can run 11 meters per second or 12 meters per second hitting their top speed. So the overall idea is when you introduce short speed work, you do want to be pretty close to your max velocity, but maybe not quite fully hitting max velocity. We keep those distances a little shorter just to reduce the total or the peak velocity that you hit in that rep. You're still able to run faster than you were in your short accelerations that you were doing before, but maybe it's not the fastest that you'll run that year, because it's early in the training year, but you're introducing maximal velocity work and you're just modifying how fast the workout is by adjusting the distances down to whatever you feel is safe for that point in time. An example short speed workout might be 2 to 5 sprints where you have a 25 meter acceleration into a 10 meter flying sprint zone. Once you've introduced short speed work to the program, we want to start to increase the acceleration distance of those flying sprints. Now, some people progress the flying sprint zone itself, but I prefer to first increase the acceleration zone before we increase the flying sprint zone itself. So as your training progresses and your body adapts to training, you can increase the acceleration distance of your flying sprint work in order to increase the velocities achieved during the training session. For example, increasing from a 25 meter acceleration zone into a 35 meter acceleration zone will bring the athlete closer to hitting maximal velocity during the flying zone itself. I prefer to increase acceleration distances first because the technical demands of an increased flying sprint zone are more demanding and should only be progressed as the athlete shows competence in their ability to maintain proper technique or speed. If you are doing flying sprints and you increase both the acceleration distance and the flying sprint distance at once, first of all, the total distance you're sprinting per sprint is going to increase fairly dramatically. The velocities you reach are going to increase, and the demand for your ability to maintain technique at speed is going to increase. And increasing all of those qualities at once may be a bit much for an athlete, and since we really want to focus on quality when we sprint, I would prefer to increase the speed by increasing the acceleration zone, keeping the flying sprint zone where it was when we were doing short speed work, or maybe adding just 5 meters to it if the athlete shows that they are technically proficient there, because the risks really go up if you're running at top speed but can't maintain your technique because the flying sprint zone is too long. And most athletes, if they're early in a training year, or even more so if it's early in their career as an athlete or early in their development, they're not going to be able to maintain their top speed for 20 meters or 30 meters, especially if it's early in the year. So increase the acceleration zone so you can hit a higher top speed, but keep the demands for technical maintenance the same, so that way you're not shocking the athlete too much, putting them at risk of injury. I just think that's a better way to go than increasing the flying sprint distance too soon. An example workout might be 2 to 4 sets of a 30-meter acceleration into a 15-meter flying sprint. So maybe before you were doing a 20 or a 25-meter acceleration, now we can go up to a 30 or a 35-meter acceleration and keep that flying sprint zone at 10 or 15 meters, and I think that's a good way to progress. Once you've done this and you've found that, okay, I can accelerate well into that zone, I'm hitting top speed in that 10 or 15 meter flying zone, now we want to increase the flying sprint distance itself. Once the athlete can successfully perform flying sprints with both shorter and longer acceleration zones, the flying sprint zone can be increased. A 10-meter flying sprint zone can progress to 15 meters, then 20, then 25, then 30. Be sure to not progress beyond the capacity of the athlete to run at maximal velocity with proper technique, as anything other than this would not be training speed itself, and it would also put the athlete at a greater risk of injury. An example of a workout during this period of time might be 3 times a 30-meter acceleration into a 30-meter flying sprint. But remember, we don't want to just jump to that 30-meter flying sprint. We need to progress through the flying sprint zone, increasing the distances gradually, say 5 meters at a time, 3 meters at a time, something like that, and only increasing that flying sprint zone as the athlete shows they can handle it from a technique and from a speed perspective. If you see the athlete dropping off significantly at the end of the rep, you need to shorten the flying sprint zone so that way the only sprinting that they're doing is acceleration and max velocity, not decelerating or falling apart. Now eventually, at some point, you might find that flying sprints over moderate distances, say a 60-meter rep where it's 30-meter acceleration into a 30-meter flying sprint, these reps may begin to lose their adaptive potency. They may start to look a little bit stagnant, or like they're not really progressing, or you're not seeing much change in their times. And this may be a point at which it's wise to introduce speed change reps into your speed training. These are typically described as sprint, float, sprint, or fast, easy, fast reps. Speed change reps challenge your ability to maintain technique and relaxation at high speeds, making them in some ways more challenging than a normal flying sprint. Typically, the total length of the fast sprint sections will be limited to 30 or 40 meters. Really, the way to look at it is that any human can run at maximal velocity for about 3 seconds. Now, if you're a slower athlete, you're not going to cover 30 meters in 3 seconds, so your flying sprint zone needs to be 20 meters or 25 meters because it takes you 3 seconds to cover 25 meters. A really fast athlete may be able to cover 35 meters in 3 seconds. So depending on how fast you run, the distance that you're covering in the fastest zones of a fast, easy, fast or sprint, float, sprint rep should be limited to about 3 seconds of max velocity sprinting. And this applies to normal flying sprints as well. If you're doing flying sprints, limit it to about 3 seconds as far as what distance you're having them do the flying sprint over. That would be kind of the maximum flying sprint distance, would be whatever distance it takes to cover in 3 seconds. With the speed change reps, the same idea would apply. It's just since you're having periods of the sprint where they aren't running all out, maybe they're running at 95% instead of 100%, you could be covering, say you accelerate and then you go, once you've accelerated, you have a 50-meter zone that's broken up into fast and slightly less fast sections. The fast sections should add up to about 3 seconds of work total. So you could do a 30-meter acceleration and then have a 10-meter float phase and then a 20-meter phase where you're running fast. It could be 40 meters into a 10-meter float and a 10-meter fast section. It could be 30 meters acceleration, 10 meters float, 10 meters fast, 10 meters float, 10 meters fast. But it doesn't have to be an even distribution. It could be 10-meter float into a 15-meter fast section, or a 15-meter float into a 10-meter fast section, or a 20-meter fast section. It's up to you how you do it. But generally speaking, the point is we want to get the athlete up to speed and then have them change their speeds by going a little bit slower, a little more relaxed, and then a little bit faster, back and forth, and they have to maintain their technique the whole way. And that's really the challenge that gets presented to the athlete when they do speed change reps. Is it's hard to maintain your technique, your posture, and your relaxation when you're going 100%, 95%, 100%, 95% back and forth. So if you find that your athlete has been doing 20-meter flies and they have stopped progressing, they aren't getting any faster, that might be a good time to throw in some speed change work and then bring back the flying sprints. Once you do the speed change work, you bring the 20-meter flies fly back in where you're just going all out that 20 meters. Then maybe you can increase the distance of the flying sprint zone from there to 30 meters. It doesn't have to be done where, you know, you only do short speed and then normal speed work and then speed change work and you never go back to normal flying sprints. Just think of this as a tool that you can use to either challenge the athlete a little bit more, increase the distance of the sprint that they're doing, but keep the amount of speed work they're doing within that rep the same. It's just kind of a tool to keep in your toolbox that I think can be useful when normal speed training has become sort of a stagnant stimulus for the athlete. Now, once we've done all-out speed work, we've done flying sprints, we've hit 30-meter flies, our times are good, we've done a little speed change work, we've done all that stuff, then I think it's time to progress to ASSE or short speed endurance. ASSE means alactic short speed endurance. So this is speed endurance work where you're not getting into a glycolytic state, you're still relying on alactic energy systems. Once the athlete has shown the ability to express speed over flying sprint zones of 30 meters or greater without technical breakdown and can perform sprints up to 60 meters with good proficiency from blocks, athletes should advance to short speed endurance work, also known as alactic short speed endurance. In my view, short speed endurance work is the most potent training a short sprinter can perform, as these reps incorporate all of the important qualities needed for a 100-meter sprinter. It includes maximal acceleration, maximal velocity, enduring speed, so continuing to sprint at max velocity without slowing down, and then resisting deceleration at the very end of the rep. Depending on the athlete, these types of sprints are typically 70 to 90 meters in length, run maximally from a starting method of your choice. Slower athletes may need to reduce distances to 50 or 60 meters because if you're hitting top speed at 30 meters, you're going to start decelerating by 50 or 60 meters. So for a slower athlete, you know, you'd want to reduce the distances, whereas faster athletes may be able to go up to 120 meters. But I think 70 to 90 is going to be the zone that is most applicable to most sprinters. The distance you choose should be limited by your ability to maintain speed, meaning that you should not exhibit significant deceleration during these sprints. You will have to resist deceleration and you may slow down just a little bit, but it shouldn't be noticeable. It shouldn't be something where if you're watching the athlete sprint, you can tell, oh, they slowed down a lot at the end of the rep. If so, it's probably too long for this type of work. Earlier in training, drop-in starts and two-point starts can be used for short speed endurance work, but you should progress to performing these types of sprints from blocks in order to develop the full race model of the 100-meter dash. So in my view, short speed endurance work is like the pinnacle of speed training. It is long enough to be a pretty potent stimulus for the body just from an overall workload standpoint. You reach really high velocities. It allows you to work on the whole race model of the 100-meter dash or the 60-meter dash, and I think it should be the ultimate goal of the sprinter to spend a lot of their time in a year working on that 70 to 90 meter zone. I think a lot of people neglect this zone. They either never reach it or they go beyond it and never actually work on that zone very much. So focusing on short speed endurance work would be kind of the end goal, but if it's a really young athlete, they may not get to that point in a year because they aren't ready for it, or other athletes may have done a lot of it already, so they're going to go a little bit longer. Great. But for most athletes, I think part of your goal with speed training should be to get to short speed endurance work, do a good amount of it at a really high level of intensity and, you know, really high quality from a technical standpoint. And if you do that, I think you can get more out of this work than most other types of sprint training as it relates to running the 100-meter dash. So before we wrap up here, I want to talk a little bit about long-term progressions over multiple years of training. So as you progress through multiple years of training, how much emphasis you place on any given form of speed training should vary based on your needs and abilities. I would avoid repeatedly following the same exact progression every year, as you are not the same athlete now as you were 3 years ago. Thus, using the same progressions you did 3 years ago might be redundant and might not be very potent from an adaptation standpoint. I think that too many people view training as a circle in time, where you start at the same point each year and follow the same progression, as if there is one specific progression that should be followed year in and year out. The reality is that training is more akin to a journey than running a lap at the track. You never return to the place that you started, at least from a physical standpoint. As you progress through training, you become a different athlete than you were when you started. You change. You have cumulative training effects that build up over time. Because of this, each year needs to be viewed as a new journey or a new trip, rather than a return to the starting line of the same lap that you ran last year. After a year of training, reassess yourself to identify what aspects of your sprinting needs to be improved the most and work on that. Incorporate that into your training progressions. You still may start off the year in the same way, but maybe your general prep phase isn't as long as it was in the past, or maybe you don't spend as much time only doing acceleration as you did in the past. Maybe last year you did it for a month, but this year you do it for 3 weeks, or a couple years ago you did it for a month and now you only do acceleration only work for 2 weeks before you progress to short speed work, because you can handle that safely without getting hurt. We want to intensify our training, and we want to progress to more specific training as soon as it is safe, so we can spend as much time in a year as possible working on things that are really going to drive improvement based on our needs. And you need to think about that when you're planning your yearly progressions. From a practical standpoint, too many athletes get stuck never progressing to short speed endurance work, or they skip over it completely in favor of longer duration speed endurance death marches. So if the farthest you sprint in training is 40 to 60 meters, or you never train the 70 to 90 meter zone, you're leaving out what I believe to be the most important training zone to develop fast sprinting. And so I would really consider, how has your training progressed in the past? How much time have you spent running between 70 and 90 meters in training? Have you done a lot of it or not? If not, it's probably something you need to incorporate. Yes, there will be times where we want to go beyond that. Yes, there's times where maybe we don't quite get up to those zones or don't spend a whole lot of time there. But like I said before, for most athletes, if you're running in the 10s, you need to be doing 70 to 90 meter sprints, and that should form kind of the foundation of your speed work, because it develops every part of the sprint that we need. The intensities are high, the velocities are high, you're relying on elasticity. It really is a great training stimulus, and that should be the ultimate goal of your speed training progressions, is to getting up to these 70 to 90 meter sprints and doing them with really high levels of quality. Now, in conclusion, if you really want to run fast, you need to gradually progress up toward the most specific and intense forms of sprinting that you can without getting injured. The distances you use for sprint training need to be the distances where you are reaching and maintaining maximal velocity, not distances where you are slowing down significantly or never even hitting top speed. Slower athletes will reach maximal velocity in less distance than faster athletes, which impacts what distances each athlete should run in order to develop speed. So if you have a group of athletes who some are significantly slower and some are significantly faster, they should not be doing the same speed workout at any given point in time, other than maybe like the first week of training, because the needs of the faster athlete, where they hit top speed, all those things are going to be different. The faster athletes hit top speed further down the track, so they should be doing speed work over longer distances than the athletes who aren't as fast. You should regress training as needed when returning from a break, but do not get stuck only doing shorter distances when you are capable of sprinting proficiently over longer speed training distances. So don't be afraid to, progress your training to something a little bit longer. If all you do are 40s, you're only working 40% of the race. So is that really going to be something that is going to make you as fast as possible? Probably not. You need to regress your training to the point where it's safe early in a year after a training break, or regress it for an athlete who doesn't have a lot of experience and isn't very fast. But if you're capable, if you are well trained, then you need to push yourself a little bit and progress up to these kind of middle zones and longer zones of speed training when it's appropriate in your training career. Utilize changes in acceleration distance, flying sprint distance, changes in speed throughout the sprint, or the starting method as you progress through your training. Earlier in the year, I would use more dynamic starts, less crouch starts, and I would progress to more and more crouch starts as you get closer to the season. You just have to be careful, because block starts and other crouch starts, like a 3 or a 4-point start, can be a little bit more harsh on your hips, adductors, and that sort of thing. So you just want to make sure that you are balancing specificity and intensity with the tissue demands, and making sure that you're not repeatedly doing the same movement pattern over and over again to the point where you get chronic overuse injuries. So feel free to change the method of starting that you use when you do speed training, but you do want to ultimately progress to the most specific form of starting, which is block starts, and that would be something that I would work up to as you get into the short speed endurance training. If you're running 70s or 90s, I would be doing some of those from blocks, so that you sort of maintain the relevance of the overall sprint to the sprint that we're trying to get better at, which is the 100-meter dash. Long term, the goal is to move toward greater levels of intensity, specificity, and velocity. This applies both within a year of training as well as over multiple years of training. So make sure that you're considering, what have I done in the past? What am I doing this year? What have I done this year? What am I going to be doing later this year? And how does progressing toward greater levels of intensity, greater specificity, and greater velocity play into that equation? And that should help guide you toward what you need to do at any given point in time. So I hope this has been helpful for you guys. I hope this gives you some idea of how you can progress your speed training throughout a year and over multiple years of training. That's all I got for you guys for now. This is Cody Bidlow with SprintingWorkouts.com and ATHLETE.X, signing off.